Hi there, welcome back. I'm Hal Harris, as you can tell from the video or the YouTube channel name. Previous video I made was a quick overview of the game that I was making on the mastered course, the D&D inspired roguelike game. It was just very quick, very brief, not in much depth, because I was trying to do it quickly for a PlayStation application instead of just submitting a link to my itch page. I wanted to make a video about a project that wasn't up on the itch page yet. And I was flying the day before, it was 11 p.m., so it was very quick, not very enthusiastic, and kind of bad. So I wanted to do a few more videos that were more in depth, better detail about everything that went on during the development of the project that I had so far, and the um, like work that went into it over the mastered or through the mastered coursework program. So this is a Trello page that was set up by my mentor for me about just tracking my progress, setting up tasks of everything I wanted to do, and like categorizing them. So we've got, if I go into here, got this label is UI. I made a load of different labels for different things so I could color code them. We've got UI, player, mechanics, AI, documentation, GitHub control, combat, inventory, level, design, etc. So like in progress here is procedural generation for Unity roguelike. I did show the procedural generation quickly in the previous video, but as you saw, my own version didn't work very well and it wasn't complete, wasn't how I liked it, so it's still in the in progress section. Um, and this I never got around to, but I'm doing it now, so I hope my mentor's okay with it being just a few months late. But here we have like all of the weekly meetings we had because we had a meeting every week about what was going on. So in week one, it was just like what I wanted to do, setting it up. Week two was just before Christmas actually, so I made like a few more things that got working. So I implemented object pooling for the first time, which I'd never done before, set up like tile map for basic level layout, and then I made like a note to say what was going to happen or what I wanted to come back to after I came back from Christmas, which is here. It was just a quick note to catch me up on what I'd done already, just in case I'd forgotten. Week three was working with converting the player to a singleton, which is also something I'd not heard of. I didn't hear, or I had learned a lot very quickly on the mastered course, which I'm very grateful for. Worked on UMLs, so I think this is a UML for, no, this inspiration for the weapon swapping system where I came up with like concepts based on previous games. So enter the gungeon, use the scroll wheel to select, and then there's the GTA with this like circle wheel. I wanted something kind of like that, but I didn't know at the time how I would make the circle UI kind of work. I didn't feel like that was in my scope for being done within a week because all of the other part of this was to try and get as much done within each week as you could. So I went with a simpler design that I was more like used to, simple like box UI with a slider, which isn't needed yet, which is why I don't have it in the current version of the game, but slider to like slide down if you have a lot of weapons, and then just buttons for each weapon to swap it to using a box or a grid layout in that system. And this is the weapon swapping UML is actually called that. So you have just like how it would activate, hold down the shift button, click on a button, it would activate the weapon selector function that would then give the relevant information to the player singleton, and then that would give further relevant information to the weapon parent script, which was attached to the player singleton object. But that was all of that, and then we have like the link to the conference that me and my mentor had that week. This in week four was where I started looking at the subject and observer pattern, which once again never done before. It was also talking about like instead of using strings for each type of weapon name, using enums, which is something I once again had not been taught about, or if I had, I hadn't been told what I could really use it for. And this is where it was made a lot clearer. My mentor was very good at getting things through clearly and just explaining things to me in a way that made it very obvious as to how useful they could be and what to use them for. So like here we have the weapon struct that uses the weapon type enum and then relates it to the public or to the game object in the game of the weapon. And it's just screenshots of things like we'd planned out and gone over and how to make an ice subject interface and things like that. Then week 5 was me doing some uh, like look into procedural generation, and I got very basic procedural generation, and I made like a paper map for how I wanted like a typical dungeon kind of thing to look, and this was like just something I drew up in a D&D map making software. It was very simple, but I just like a kind of mock out layout plan for if I had a randomly generated dungeon level, what it would look like, and I wanted something like that. And then I made the complete version of that mockup in the Unity game, which I've shown previously. I don't think I showed all of it, but it was in that previous video. Week 6 was about more enemy AI, and this was like the state machine for the enemy AI that I wanted to have. So um, kind of like if the player's nowhere near the enemy, then they stop moving and turn off the sprite, which I showed in the previous video as well. So if you haven't seen that, go and check it out, because a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here I did briefly show in the previous video, and I do want to go more in depth over some of these things because I didn't get to go over everything I wanted to in time in that previous video. But then if you're near the player, or if the player is within range of the enemy, they will initially just stand and not move, and then they'll go to patrol, and once they're done patrolling for a bit, they'll stand still for a bit, and they'll keep looping back and forth until they find the player, in which case they'll go to the chase, and then if they're just like a melee enemy, they'll just rush towards and attack. If they're a ranged enemy, I was thinking they would try and like hide behind cover a bit and then like poke out, shoot a projectile of whatever means, an arrow, a crossbow bolt, etc., and then get back into a tactical position. So they would try and move away if they could, and then if they were for whatever reason scared of the player, they just try and run away. There's a few ways to incite fear in D&D, and I thought I could use that mechanic as well. But yeah, that was week 6, was mostly looking at the AI behavior of enemies, which I did go into a bit. Week 7, 8, and 9, I don't think had many notes, and the reason for that is because it was mostly me trying to redo the project in a lot better of like a layout, because all of the files were a mess, all of the code was a mess. As you've seen, it's still not great, but it's a lot better than it was, and that's what happened in week 7 and 8, um, uh, and week 9 a bit as well. Then week 10, you have this was like a mock-up of how I could use scriptable objects and things for projectile object pooling. So instead of having like an object pool of daggers, arrows, crossbow bolts, etc., just have one generic projectile object and then pass in the data pack scriptable object to that physical pooled object to change its shape, damage, sprite, etc., and make it be the correct projectile for the current weapon that you're using. And it was also about generating the A-star pathfinding system for my enemies, which I did do briefly and showed. It's not optimal by any means because it checks kind of every square within range of the enemy, and it'd be much more efficient to check like a chunk of tiles and then the next chunk of tiles and next chunk of tiles, compare the distance and like the relative A-star scores to like between the chunk and the next chunk rather than every single tile between you and the enemy. But that was something I wanted to get on later and improve. This in week 11. this was talking about better collision detection in Unity because I was previously using um, collision.gameObject.getTag or something along those lines, where it's better to do it in this method, which I've forgotten the name of. I did show it in the previous video, but it's to do with the binary and the layering of collision data in Unity, so I can turn off and on uh, what uh, which layers interact with each other layer, so that I can basically ignore collisions I don't want to happen and turn on collisions that I do want to happen, and then check it using this line of code here, which my mentor was helping me show, or helping me understand at the time. And then we had like weapon templates to do the same kind of thing I'd done with the generic projectiles, and make it the same for weapons. So instead of swapping between a different physical weapon game object, it had like one game object for the weapon and swapped between the different um, data packs that were scriptable objects, so that it worked that way and was more efficient. Instead of having several different game objects for every single weapon, it was just different data packs. And it's not complete because, as you saw in the previous video, I didn't quite finish it with the weapon swapping, but it does now use the data pack system. And then what else was in week 11 quickly? Finishing the level generator, and it was I made the static dice class, which, as you could see, it took till week 11 in the production of this to consider that might be a good idea. But yeah, there was also exiting the chase behavior because that hadn't happened yet. So once the enemy started chasing the player, they just kind of kept chasing the player. And it was around this time, week 11 or 12, that I got a part-time job to help just like pay for things with my family, so I didn't get to work on the game as much as I wanted to. But I made a interface for the weapons so that each weapon works on an interface, and instead of each weapon having like an attack function in its own script, they all have an interface which has the attack action, and then within each weapon script they have a different action that occurs within the attack function, if that makes any sense at all. So that it's more streamlined. I can just do like weapon dot attack rather than current weapon dot game object dot get script dot attack kind of thing. It's a lot more efficient and just easier to read that way. Week 13 was to do with a like visual gizmo for the weapon projectiles. So I was using the daggers previously to show like the area of spread they could have, because this is when I started taking into account like player statistics and spread and other things like that. And then I also had one of the dungeon generators added enemies at the start of the level that to test like actual dungeon generation. I once again, after editing things, I don't think it currently works, but there was a point where the dungeon did correctly generate place the player, place enemies, and it would start. There were definitely a few issues with it, but it was somewhat functional. And I also had the shop special scene, which should have been ticked off. Maybe I didn't do it at the time, but I had the separate shop scene where you could interact with the shopkeeper NPC and like buy items off him using your currency of gold, which did work as well. This was just fixing issues with the dungeon generator, for example. Like the hallways weren't as big as I wanted them to be, and for some reason I couldn't make them 2x2 as hard as I tried. I did eventually solve that by making the hallways a bit bigger. It was just an issue with the corners not like generating correctly because it wasn't making a square. It was just trying to fill out like the above and below, which wasn't always the case. So I found that issue, fixed it, added a few different prefab room types, and then had a problem with the doors where it would sometimes not be able to reach a door using its depth first search programming. So I fixed the issue basically by just saying if it can't reach it after a certain number of attempts, just ignore the walls and boundaries and just kind of cut through any rooms you have or any rooms you need to reach your next target door, except for the boss room and the start room, because we didn't really want those to be cut through, especially the boss room, because if the boss just started roaming the halls on its own, it would be a bit of a surprise to the player. But that was one of the few weeks after I got my job where I actually did manage to get everything done. Then week 15 was basically trying to wrap things up, talk about things, figure out what I had to do and what I didn't have to do, what still needed to be done, where I should go next, because next week I was going to have to present it and would basically just be left alone. It was preparing for like potential interviews as well that were going to be found through the master course, which never ended up happening, but that's just because of issues at the time and nothing to do with like fault of them or fault of me. Probably more fault of me for not doing enough work at the time, but as I said, I joined a part-time job and was struggling to manage everything. But yeah, that's where that was. And then we had week 16 was just like talking back about everything I'd learned and everything I was going to do in the future. And as you can see, my final thoughts, I'm not sure, because I don't know exactly what's going to go on, what I should do, where I want to go, but I know I want to make games, and I hope that I can get this PlayStation internship. It would be the best thing that's ever happened to me, possibly other than meeting my current partner, but that's a different story. Yeah, be the best possible job position I could get. So I also have like a link to my itch up here. What else did we have? This was talking about like one-page examples for when I was first making my like project, what it had to do to make a one-page um, document to present what I wanted to do. This was links to like helpful YouTube videos for like scriptable objects, cave generation, um, things like that, and procedural generation, object pooling, and then there might be a few other things over here. No, I think most of it was over there. But as you can see, a lot of planning, a lot of thought, a lot of development went on to this page and throughout the entire development of the project, but also at the initial phases of everything. So it's not just randomly coding anything and everything. I wanted to. A lot of thought went into what I could do each week, how I could learn something new and use those new mechanics and functions and just aspects of programming that I didn't already know to make my game more efficient and just work better, be more fun, function just in general. And I'm very grateful for my mentor for helping me through all of it. It was complex, a lot of it, but he was there to support me all the way as much as I needed, and very grateful, especially he was in America and had to wake up at like 6 a.m. every time we had a meeting. So thank you for that. But yeah, this was just like a look into the planning aspects of everything rather than the actual project and coding side of things. So I hope you've enjoyed, and yeah, I will make a deeper dive into the programming aspects of things going further in depth in the scripts and what each function is for, how it works, how it operates, and try and hopefully fix a few things up as well. But yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video. Bye.